The wind howled across the frozen tundra of the lands of always winter, and a lone figure trudged through the snow, his cloak shredded, his face stiff with cold and defeat. He was not of the North, or at least not of the North as the men of Westeros remembered. His name, once known in the red halls of Winterfell, in the candle-lit crypt beneath the weirwood trees, had changed many times, but in this harsh land of ice and blue eyes, he was simply the Wolf of the Frost, a creature forged in ice where fire dared not warm. In that moment, he paused at the edge of an ancient cairn, his hand gripping the haft of a great sword, the blade half buried in the gleaming snow. With each breath he exhaled mist, his heartbeat steady, eyes fixed on the horizon where the realm of men ended and the darkness began. 12 years old the boy had been when his world shattered. Hurried beyond the wall, a trap sprung by desperate men trying to cling to land they no longer held rightful claim to. His father's banners torn, his house scattered. The boy, separated from his kin, with no Winterfell hearth to return to, watched the sky light up with eerie azure light and saw the others come, the pale riders who commanded the dead, the cold masters of bone and shadow. The boy should have died. He felt the chill pierce his throat as he watched his father's men fall one by one, their eyes going black, their bodies rising anew under the touch of the white-blue gaze of the creatures. But he did not die. Instead, he watched terrified as the darkness claimed his world, and then a hand of ice reached out, not to kill him but to drag him in. He woke in a frozen cavern, far from the flickering hearths of Winterfell. Above him vaulted arches of ice, runes carved into the walls, spirals of ancient magic he did not understand. The White Walkers stood before him, silent but for the hiss of bone and the crackle of frost. They looked at him not as prey, no, he realized. They looked at him as something else, something lost but salvageable. The boy's heart hammered. He tried to call out, but his voice froze in his throat. One of the walkers stepped forward, its blue gaze boring into his. The sword he held, a Stark blade still, though older than him, still stained, fell from his fingers, thudding softly into the snow. He expected pain, death, but instead the walker placed a hand on his shoulder. The chill of death itself traveled through him, and yet he didn't collapse. He shivered. The world slipped, and when the boy opened his eyes again, he was no longer the boy. He was a pledge. He would become a general. Under the Cold Master's tutelage, he learned as no man of the South could. He learned how to ride the winds of winter, how to whisper commands to wights rising from the dead, how to listen to the song of ice cracking beneath enemy boots. In the absence of sun, his mind sharpened. The discipline of House Stark, the oath of the North were there still, but twisted, tempered in frost. He remembered his promise, for the North, for his father, for the wolves, but the promise changed. In the cold dark, honor came in new form. Survival, inevitability of the long night. He climbed the ranks among the other creatures who feared no fire, commanded no pity. The white-blue eyes of the walkers regarded him as something other than human, and that otherness became his armor. Far to the south, in Winterfell, the North mourned. The banners of Stark fluttered ghost-thin in the January winds. Lady Catelyn wept in the Godswood. The weirwood's red sap whispered through her veins. Robb, Arya, Bran, each looked to the door hoping for the return of the father who left to war and never came back. They thought him dead. They whispered his name in tears. But across the wall, the boy he once had been now sat astride an icy throne in the frozen fortress of his captors, his cloak of white fur thrown back, his sword resting on the snow. And the legions of the undead at his back listened when he spoke. The first time he led them south, it felt unnatural. The snow melted as they crossed the wall. The Black Watchers looked up in horror as the frozen dead marched through the shattered gates. The boy, now man, rode at the forefront, the sigil of the stag still carved on his shield though the paint flaked, the wood bleached. He raised his sword and the white surged. Men screamed, horses reared, metal rang, but it was chaos orchestrated by him. For a moment he saw the vision of his father, proud, honorable, and somewhere in the thunder of the attack, the man who raised him as a child, the grey-haired steward of Winterfell, darted into his mind. The man's voice echoed, "When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives." Game of Thrones, Wiki +1. The pack had changed. The wolves now hunted the pack of men. In the wake of the massacre, he felt something he did not recognize: remorse. But he had learned well. Remorse in this land was betrayal. The walkers did not ask for regret. They asked for certainty. He had given them his oath. His honor was remade. The North might say winter is coming, but in his world winter had come and the living were already too late. Wikipedia, and yet, hidden beneath the ice, the memory of home warmed him in secret. He still saw his children's faces, Rob's fierce loyalty, Arya's spark, Bran's curiosity, even though none of them knew he lived. He wondered, would they recognize the man he had become? This question gnawed at him in the silent hours before dawn, when the frost crept across his chamber, and the only sound was the drip of melting ice. Honor had been the reason he left the wall once, but now it was the reason he stayed. He must remember the man he was, to become the man they needed, either savior or destroyer. South of the wall, the kingdoms rallied. Rumors spread of a new commander, pale as moonlight, riding an army of the dead under the banner of a butchered stag. Some laughed. They said the North spun tales. The Meisters in the Citadel shook their heads and added footnotes about the others. Game of Thrones wiki. But the couriers who survived told of a flayed corpse raising itself to slice a horseman's throat with a broken sword. They told of the Wolf of Ice leading the charge. The South was unprepared because they still believed the wall held. He exploited that. He moved silently, so many steps ahead until the kingdoms believed the long night was only myth. He returned to the ancient stronghold of the Starks one night in a dream. The scent of pine and cold stone. A younger version of himself with clean hair, with a smile, with the warmth of home in his chest. He stood in the courtyard of Winterfell, watchers at his shoulder, blades drawn. His siblings approached wide-eyed. "Father," Bran said. The word echoed like a knife. The boy inside him recoiled. He saw Catelyn, the sorrow in her eyes, the children behind her. No anger, only disappointment. The vision dissolved. He awoke on a slab of ice, his sword cold in his hand. The white-blue eyes looked at him, waiting. The boy inside learned fear, but he also learned control. The walkers offered him more than just power. They offered purpose. The long years beyond the wall had taught him that the living had made many mistakes. Arrogance, betrayal, pride. The walkers moved beyond such mortal flaws. They marched because they must. The boy who was once Ned Stark chose to believe that purpose. In his mind, the kingdoms of men were not worth saving. Not if they could not save themselves. He had seen the corruption of the South, the shallow vows of kings, the broken promises in Winterfell's hallways. He remembered his oath to protect, and he also remembered its failure. Now he would rebuild it. Only the weak died. Only the resolute endured. Only the resolute endured. On his first mission as general of the White Host, he laid siege to a castle in the north, where the Starks once held dominion. The men of the north spilled from the gates, their armor scratched, their wolf emblems tarnished. "Stark!" they cried. They saw a pale figure riding at the front, the blade raised, the horse's breath misting in the moonlight. He thundered into them. Swords clashed with the screech of metal and the sobs of men whose fathers they were. He spared none. The wolves of Winterfell charged and died. The living ones. The dead ones stood and rose again at his command. He looked upon their terror and felt only the winter's satisfaction. Logic governed him now, but in the bleakness there remained a spark of empathy, just enough to question what fate demanded of him. In one moment, as he stood over a fallen banner of House Stark, he felt the echo of his childhood, the sound of direwolves howling, the lift of his father's voice calling him to arms, the smell of roast venison in the great hall. He pressed his gloved hand to the flag, closed his eyes, and the blade on his back dripped with someone's blood. The walkers whispered, "Finish it." It was over. The North would kneel. The long night had arrived. But he paused. The ghost of a childhood vow surfaced. Protect them. Protect the North. Not destroy it. He shook his head. That was the old man's thinking. The new oath, rebuild from the frost. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, the small council quaked at the news. A storm of bones and ice was coming. Rumors traveled faster than ravens, faster than armies, and the people of the Seven Kingdoms felt the chill long before the snow. Thousands died, kingdoms crumbled, and the Night's Watch watched the wall melt beneath the onslaught. They looked at the stags and lions and eagles and thought, this is what happens when we do nothing. He watched them. He calculated. He found that men in their castles believed in shields and walls. Walls crack, shields break. Only an idea wrought in ice could endure. He led his troops, now countless, now unstoppable, and the kingdoms bled quietly at first, then screamed in desperation. But the Stark memory did not fade. One winter night, his sister Arya sneaked into the godswood, the weirwood's red sap bright against the white. She knelt before the tree, tears freezing on her cheeks, and whispered, "Father, come back." And for a moment he heard, not in the grown man, not in the Walker general, but in the boy who once wielded a wooden sword in Winterfell's yard. He touched the edge of the weirwood's root in his mind and felt the promise made so long ago, "I will protect you." But the promise still echoed. He realized that the Walkers had given him power, but he would decide its direction. The armies of the dead did not ask for mercy, but mercy, he learnt, was his to choose. In the next siege he paused before sweeping the gates. The men of the north opened the doors, expecting pity, expecting a father's mercy. Instead they saw him in full regalia, fur, bone, ice, and the wolf banner reversed. He called out, "Kneel or fall." It was not a plea. It never was. The men cried out. Some fled, some charged. The dead rose behind him. When it ended, a flag fluttered in the icy breeze, the direwolf inverted in white, the snow the only remaining color. He watched the men beg. He granted them survival, not as a reward but as a tool. Some cities he razed, some he left standing. The message, the old world is over. Yet inside him a war raged. There was the commander of White Walkers, ever cold, unfeeling, efficient. And there was the father, the Stark, the boy whose hand was held by his mother's farewell. In quiet hours he walked the frozen halls of his fortress, looked at the trophies of conquest and asked, for what end? The Walkers asked for the end. The Starks taught for the people. He asked the question neither had asked. What if protecting the realm means ruling it by fear? He turned the question inward and accepted. What if the man who once honored his word must now break every vow to fulfill it? In the south, the Maesters crowded the citadel, tracking the spiral of death, the cold footprints of the wolf of ice. They whispered the north was lost, but what they did not know was that the wolf gave the order. They did not know the man at the summit of the icy host was once the Lord of Winterfell. He led his army beyond the wall, beyond the living memory, beyond the laws of men. And when he returned to Westeros, he returned not as lord but as judge, not as warden, but as Winter's voice. In the courtyard of his fortress, standing at dusk, he looked south through a telescope carved of bone and steel. The red fires of the south glowed in the distance, lanterns, beacons, swords being sharpened. He remembered the summer evenings in Winterfell, laughter, children at play, his daughters' voices echoing in the hall, and he understood. The world he protected had betrayed him. His children believed him dead. The north believed the wall safe. The south believed the north idle. And all of them would learn. The wall fell because they trusted it. He would lead them now. He raised his sword. The blue flame of ice glowed along the blade. He called to his generals. We march at dusk. The cavalry of whites formed lines, horse and rider both white. The wind picked up. He felt it in his bones. The howl of the storm, the bite of death, the promise of rebirth in ice. The long night was not coming. It was here. In that charged silence before the march, he thought of his children again. Did Robb remember the tournaments and the banners? Did Sansa still dream of ladies and courts and gold? Did Arya still roll under tables, smiling? Did Bran still climb the tower, watching the stars? Rickon, small and fierce. The memory shattered him, not enough to stop him, but enough to steel him. He would do what he must. He would build a new Winterfell, one of ice, one of truth. As the ride began, the cavalry thundered. Snow and ash flew into the sky as villages burned. The living fled, the dead pursued. The man once known as Ned Stark raised his voice, and the army answered with a roar that echoed like the shattering of 1,000 shields. The kingdoms turned their eyes north. Their bannermen trembled, and the musicians in King's Landing ceased their songs. The long night had a general. A Stark turned into the ultimate weapon of winter. And somewhere in the smoky ruins of Winterfell, the Stark children heard a whisper. Father. They paused. A chill came through the hall, but when they rushed outside, all they saw was the dawn pale. the direwolf banner silently drifting in the breeze. They did not know he had returned. They did not know who he had become. They did not know who he had become. The snow drifted in waves, swallowing all sound, but not fast enough to muffle the screams echoing from the valley below. Smoke curled toward the sky in slow spirals, as the remnants of House Umber's final stand turned to ash. The last Umber heir had refused to kneel. He'd raised the ancient sword of his ancestors and shouted, "For the North!" as if the North hadn't already been claimed, as if the wolf who led the dead was not also born of the same blood. The white wolf had not flinched. He had watched the boy die as he watched all others, without expression, without fury, without mercy. One command, a flick of the hand, and the dead surged like a wave over the castle walls. The North was falling, not to flame or siege, but to silence. Icy, unrelenting silence. Further south, in the smoky confines of Winterfell's rebuilt hall, Robb Stark sat at the high table, his eyes sunken, his fingers tapping. He could feel something wrong deep in the bones of the stone. He didn't know why, but the chill in the air hadn't lifted in weeks. Ravens from the wall had stopped arriving. Small folk from villages along the King's Road whispered of blue-eyed corpses, of armies that didn't bleed, of a spectre riding with a sword that froze men with a glance. Some said the gods had risen, some said the dead walked again. Robb wanted to believe none of it, but when Ser Rodrik rode back from the last hearth and said it was gone, completely vanished into ice and silence, he knew the stories weren't tales. The North was at war, but not with men. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister leaned over the map of Westeros and frowned. "They're calling him the Ice Father now," he muttered, voice dry and bitter. Varys stood beside him, unusually silent, unusually pale. "Do we even know it's him?" Tyrion continued, tapping the map near the wall. "Or is this another shadow tale from old Nan-made flesh?" Varys spoke without looking up. The boy who vanished beyond the wall returned, not as a ghost, not as a man, but as something new. "And he's burning the North with frost." Tyrion laughed, a short, empty sound. "Of course he is. Ned Stark returns from the dead only to kill the realm he once protected. Poetic." Cersei sat by the window, wine untouched, staring northward. "How long before he reaches us?" she asked. No venom in her tone for once, just fear. Pure and trembling. The kingdoms had always feared what lay beyond the wall, but they'd never imagined the wall would fall to a Stark. And not just any Stark, the Ned Stark. Word had reached every corner of Westeros. The general of the White Walkers wore Stark furs, carried a Stark sword, moved with the honorable silence that once made lords follow him into battle. But now the silence was darker, colder. He said nothing, spared no one, and left behind nothing but frost and rot. Town after town fell, and with each conquest his army grew, not just in number but in resolve. He didn't rage. He didn't revel in blood. He simply proceeded, as if this was a task, as if this was destiny. Arya Stark rode alone through the woods outside Moat Cailin, her face worn, her eyes sharper than ever. She had heard the rumors, her father's face leading the dead, her father's voice giving commands that tore northern castles apart. She didn't believe it, couldn't, yet something inside her had shifted. She remembered his voice, remembered his hand on her shoulder. "Be strong," he'd said before leaving Winterfell for King's Landing. And she had, strong enough to kill, strong enough to survive, but not strong enough to ignore what the whispers claimed. Her father was alive, and he was no longer her father. She rode north anyway, alone, blade ready, her heart torn in ways no assassin training could mend. Sansa remained at the Eyrie, surrounded by icy walls and political games that now seemed laughable in the face of what was coming. She watched the flames in the hearth at night, listened to the birds go silent as the cold wind blew in. She'd always known the world was cruel. She'd always suspected that the throne corrupted everyone it touched. But now the world was being judged not by men but by something deeper, by winter itself. She dreamt of her father standing in the snow, pale and regal, his eyes no longer brown but blue as the wall. She woke each time shivering. Back in the far north, the man once called Ned Stark stood before the cracked remains of the night fort, his gaze drawn southward. The wall was behind him now. The past, too. He no longer flinched when men begged. He no longer hesitated when women cried for their children. He had seen too much, felt too little. But there was one thing that had returned to him: names. He spoke them in his sleep. Catelyn, Arya, Robb, Sansa, Jon, Bran. Each name a wound that would not heal. Each name a blade in his chest. He never told the White Walkers of these names. He kept them hidden, locked in the icebox of his soul like whispers behind the wind. The Walkers were pleased. Their general moved without pause, without question. And yet, he had begun to deviate. Small things. Letting villagers flee instead of raising them. Staring too long at family sigils before burning them. Refusing to raise certain bodies. The others noticed, but they said nothing. For now, the armies of men began to gather. At River Run, Tully banners rose. At Storm's End, Baratheon colours flew once more. In Dorne, even the stubborn princes began to whisper of sending aid. The North may fall, but if the South united, perhaps this frozen madness could be stopped. They needed a leader, someone who understood honor, someone who understood the North. And Jon Snow's name rose on the lips of many. A Stark still, though bastard-born. A man of the Watch, a fighter, a leader. Jon rode to Winterfell under cloak of darkness, hoping to find allies. What he found was ash and bone. The castle still stood, barely, but its gates were cracked and its walls scorched with frostburn. He wandered the halls and wept. He called out to ghosts. He waited for the echo of family. Instead, he found a message carved in the heart tree. Only winter remains, no signature. But he knew who had written it. And he knew then the truth. His father had returned, and his father was leading the apocalypse. Meanwhile, in the shadows beyond the Blackwater, Varys plotted. "We must break the spell," he told Tyrion. "He wasn't born of ice. He was made by it. That means he can be unmade." Tyrion stared at his cup. "You're assuming there's still a man in there. What if there isn't?" Varys didn't blink. "Then we give him a reason to remember." Arya reached the frozen ruins of Carhold before any other Stark. She crept through the remains of the keep, dodging wights, watching from shadows. She saw him, her father, or what wore his face, standing atop the battlements commanding the dead. She almost called out. Her throat burned. Her fingers reached for her blade. But her legs refused to move. Her heart shattered. It wasn't a monster wearing her father's skin. It was him. She could tell. And he looked sad. That night, when the moon was full and pale, Arya crept into the camp of the dead. No alarms were raised. The whites ignored her, sensing her silence, her blood. She moved like a ghost. She found the command tent, if it could be called that, a circle of stone and frost, and there he was, sitting, sword across his lap, eyes closed. She stepped forward. The ice crunched. He opened his eyes. "Arya," he said, and her blade slipped from her hand. She fell to her knees. Tears froze on her. "Face, you're real," she whispered. He didn't smile. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked up. "What are you doing?" she begged. "What I must," he replied. "No," she said. "This isn't you." He looked away. "It is now." She stood. "Then kill me. If you're them." Kill me. He didn't move, and that's when she knew. He wasn't fully theirs, not yet, but he was slipping. Fast they stood in silence, father and daughter surrounded by death, and the only sound was the snow falling like ash. Death, and the only sound was the snow falling like ash. The silence between them stretched like a frozen lake, thin, fragile, ready to crack. Arya's breath fogged in the air as she stood before the man who had once been her world. Her father, her protector, her North Star, but now he was pale, carved in stillness, more statue than man. The blue in his eyes wasn't natural. It wasn't just ice. It was magic, possession, power. And yet, when he said her name, it wasn't the voice of a monster. It was him. She took a step closer. No swords, no fury, no vengeance. Just the child inside her clawing for something to hold on to. "You remember me," she said softly. Not a question. A plea. Ned blinked slowly. The storm within him stirred. He could see her face in flashes, a blur of dark hair, mud-splattered cheeks, the smirk she wore when she broke rules at Winterfell. He remembered teaching her how to balance needle. He remembered her laughter echoing across the courtyard. Those memories were not dead. They were buried, encased in layers of ice, but still breathing. And now staring at her, something cracked. "I never forgot," he said. Arya shook her head, furious tears slipping down her cheeks. "Then why are you doing this? Why are you killing our people?" Ned turned his back. The frost beneath his feet cracked with every step. "Because they're not ours anymore." Arya's fists clenched. "That's not true." You're still Stark, you're still my father. He stopped walking. The wind howled like a wounded wolf. No, he said. I'm what the realm made me. What it needed when they abandoned honor and broke the world. The words struck Arya like a punch to the gut. She wanted to scream, to fight, but deep down she knew what he meant. She had walked that line herself, vengeance disguised as duty, survival masquerading as strength, but she hadn't crossed it. Not fully. And neither had he. Not yet. I came to bring you home, she said, softer now. There is no home, he whispered. Then, without another word, he turned and vanished into the white, his cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. Arya was alone again, the frost slowly reclaiming the ground he had walked on. She didn't sleep that night. And when she left the camp before dawn, her footsteps were untracked. The dead didn't stop her. She was blood of the wolf, and for the first time in years, she had a new mission, save her father from himself. Far to the south, Jon Snow stood before the shattered remnants of the Night's Watch. The wall was no more. The stronghold at Castle Black burned with blackened timbers and broken oaths. Only a dozen men remained, dressed in patchwork armor, their eyes hollow. Jon had seen death. He'd seen betrayal. But what stood beyond the north was something else. It wasn't war. It wasn't conquest. It was a reckoning. He gathered the remaining crows, the wildlings who hadn't fled, and the lords of the Vale, the Riverlands, even some from the Reach. He told them the truth. That the long night had returned, that the general of the dead was Eddard Stark, that their time was measured in hours, not months. Some didn't believe. Some laughed. Some spat at the mention of a dead man leading an army, until they saw the sky. The blizzard that rolled in over the neck wasn't natural. It came with no wind, no warning. Just a curtain of white that swallowed towns whole. Inside it, the dead. Jon stood before them on a hill near White Harbour, watching the mist creep like fingers across the land. And then he saw him, the man he'd once called father, cloaked in pale wolf fur, sword glinting like moonlight, mounted on a black steed with eyes like ice. No army cheered. The dead didn't cheer. They just moved, obedient and inevitable. Jon's heart cracked. You were the best man I ever knew, he whispered to himself. And now you're going to end everything you fought to protect. He turned to the lords behind him. We don't fight to win, he said. We fight to remind him who he used to be. Across the battlefield, the walkers watched Jon Snow. They knew his blood. They felt his connection. And in whispers that only they could hear, they murmured of danger, of memories, of the ties that bind. The general, Ned, was showing signs of fracture. He disobeyed subtle orders. He hesitated before raising certain corpses. The child he once was, who once stood before the heart tree in Winterfell, still lingered. They began to question. Could they trust him? He began to question. Could he trust himself? And somewhere within the cracks of his resolve, the voice of Catelyn Stark called out. In dreams, in nightmares. In shame, she screamed for her children. Screamed for her husband, and every time Ned woke with frost clinging to his fingertips. He began making mistakes, small ones at first, letting a captured lord live, delaying a siege, speaking aloud names he should have forgotten. His commanders watched. The Night King, ancient and silent, stood over the edge of a cliff and turned his gaze inward. This general had once been a child of summer, and summer was poisoning the winter. Back at Dragonstone, Daenerys Targaryen debated whether to ride north. Her dragons were restless. The fire in their bellies churned at the presence of the unnatural cold. She didn't trust Jon Snow, but she trusted the dead even less. Her council advised against it. But then the birds came. First one, then three, letters written in Arya's hand. Descriptions of a man who looked like a father, but moved like a stranger. A warning he remembers Arya had written, but he's forgetting fast. Daenerys stood at the cliff watching Drogon stir. If fire can't kill a White Walker, she asked aloud, can it bring back a Stark? There was no answer. Only wind. Jon and Arya reunited near the ruins of Deepwood Motte. The embrace was quick, filled with unshed tears. They spoke of Ned, of what he had become, of what he still might be. We can't kill him, Arya said. We have to bring him back. Jon's jaw clenched. So if we wait too long, there'll be nothing left to bring. They formed a plan. One last gambit, not to defeat him, but to make him remember. And they would need more than fire and steel. They would need the thing Ned Stark once valued more than anything: family. Back at the front, the walkers began forming their own plan. The general was cracking, and the last time a human cracked, it became the Night King. They wouldn't allow it again. They would end him before he betrayed them, and so the War of Ice turned inward. As Westeros prepared for annihilation, the true battle began, not for the Iron Throne, but for the soul of Eddard Stark. And the frost was thinning, which meant summer might rise again. Summer might rise again. The wind bit hard as it swept through the ruined remnants of Moat Cailin, stripping banners from shattered poles and filling the air with the moans of the restless dead. The cold was alive here, not just a temperature but a presence. A watcher. A weight pressing on every soul that dared to cross into the White Wolf's territory. Snow covered blood, but the stains always bled through eventually. And tonight, the snow would run red again. Jon stood atop the ridge, his black cloak whipping behind him, Ghost at his side. Arya crouched near a fallen tree, eyes scanning the fog that crawled between the stones. They'd come not with armies, not with dragons, but alone. Not because they wanted to be alone, but because they knew the only way to reach him was without threat. He was too powerful now, too far gone, and yet still close enough to hear his children's voices. Maybe if they were lucky. If something inside him still bled. Behind the curtain of frost, Ned Stark stood on the edge of the battlements, watching them through eyes that no longer shimmered brown, but blazed cold blue. The walkers stood behind him, silent, watchful, their magic flickering in the air. They knew what this meeting meant, and they were ready to strike. Their trust had begun to crack. And a broken tool was no tool at all. But Ned hadn't told them everything. He hadn't told them that his dreams had changed, that the whispers had become clearer, that his sword, once a perfect instrument of frost, now trembled when he thought of Winterfell, not the castle, but the people who made it home. Arya stepped forward first, hands raised, no blade, no fight. "Just her, you remember," she said gently. "I know you do." Jon followed, slower, heart hammering. "You taught us honor, duty, you died for it." The silence stretched long, brutal. Then Ned descended from the wall, every step crunching with the weight of memory and magic. His voice was rough with frost. "Why did you come?" Jon's eyes filled with 1,000 unsaid things. "Because I needed to see if you were still in there." Ned's gaze flicked to Arya. "I told you to be strong." "I was," she said. "But I didn't do it alone. We're Starks. We survived together." Ned turned away, the wind howling around them. "I survived alone." "No," Jon said quickly. "You died alone. But you came back different." A long pause. "Did I?" he asked, softer. Arya stepped closer, trembling. "They're watching." "I know they are." "The others." "The walkers." "They're afraid." Ned turned slowly. His eyes shimmered, something behind the blue. A flicker. "A memory. They should be," he said. Jon's hand drifted to Longclaw, not to draw it, but to feel its weight. "Then help us. Fight them. End this." The air shifted. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze, and then the shriek came, piercing, inhuman. The walkers were moving, not toward Jon, not toward Arya, but toward Ned. He turned sharply, watching the shadows ripple around him. They had come to kill their general, to erase the risk of human weakness, mercy, love. They had felt the crack and they were sealing it the only way they knew how. Ned raised his sword just in time to block the icy blade of the first walker. Sparks of frost exploded between them. The impact pushed him back. Jon drew Longclaw instantly. Arya vanished into the mist. The old man, the Stark, the father, the general, was now their only shield against a wrath they'd never seen before. He fought like a storm. Every movement precise, controlled, deadly. The sword that once brought justice now carved through the ice that had once made him. But he was slowing. The magic that sustained him wavered, his allegiance frayed. The walkers knew, and they came in numbers. Jon fought beside him, clashing blades with the frozen monsters. "I'll fight like a Stark," he shouted through gritted teeth. "I never stopped being one," Ned growled. Arya struck from the shadows, her blade finding the soft gaps in the icy armor. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about redemption. Together they held them off, but not forever. The largest of the walkers stepped forward, taller than the rest, older, crowned in icy horns. The one they called the First, the one who had turned Ned in the first place. He raised his spear and the world stopped breathing. Ned looked back at Jon and Arya. "Run," he said. "No." Arya snapped. "We came to save you," Jon said. Ned's eyes shimmered again. "Not blue now, grey, stark grey. You already did," he whispered. And then he turned to face the... First, the battle that followed wasn't between ice and fire. It was between ice and memory, between what Ned had become and what he once was. Every strike from the first cracked the ground, sent magic spiraling. But Ned held fast. For every move he recalled a name, a moment, a promise to Lyanna, to Catelyn, to Robb, to Jon, to Arya, to the North. The final blow came when Ned dropped his sword, opened his arms, and stepped into the first's attack. But instead of falling, he caught the spear in both hands. And for the first time, the ancient weapon shattered, the first recoiled, and Ned stepped forward. "No more," he said. The walkers screamed. The army faltered and the frost began to melt. He turned to Jon and Arya, blood on his lips, frost cracking from his skin. "I can't stop them all, but I can stop myself." Jon's voice shook. "What are you saying?" Ned staggered. "I was their general, their anchor. If I die, the chain breaks," Arya screamed. "There has to be another way." Ned smiled, soft, warm, human. "Not this time." He turned, raised his arms and roared, an ancient, thunderous cry that split the sky. The walkers froze, then shattered. The whites dropped, the blizzard ended, and Ned Stark fell to his knees, the blue leaving his eyes. He looked at Jon, at Arya, and whispered, "Tell them. I kept my vow, then he fell and winter broke. Kept my vow, then he fell and winter broke." The skies over the north no longer bled white. In the silence that followed Eddard Stark's final breath, the frost that had clung to the world began to loosen its grip. The snow still fell, but softer now. Natural, gentle. The kind of snow the North once celebrated in stories, not the kind that devoured armies and froze screams mid-air. The blizzard that had once blanketed half of Westeros began to retreat like a beast in shame. Across the forests and valleys and blood-soaked fields, the dead collapsed as one. Whites who had clawed at the gates of Winterfell now lay still. No resurrection. No twitch, no rising. Just stillness. Death. The real kind. Arya sat in the snow next to her father's body, arms wrapped around her knees. Blood dried on her hands, jaw clenched so tight it ached. She didn't cry, not yet. Her face was stone, but her heart was raw. She stared at the man who had become a monster, and then a martyr. He had come back as a weapon of winter, and yet, in the end, he died a Stark. Jon knelt on the other side, one hand resting on the hilt of Longclaw, the other buried in the snow near Ned's shoulder. He couldn't speak. His breath caught in his throat, and his thoughts were an ocean of storms. He'd prepared to kill this man, had convinced himself it was necessary. But in the end, he hadn't needed to strike. He hadn't needed to destroy. He had only needed to remind. That realization burned almost worse than anything else. Behind them, the battlefield lay littered with icy fragments of shattered walkers. What had once seemed like gods were now nothing but brittle glass bones, broken and steaming in the soft, returning sunlight. The living began to emerge from hiding, wildlings, scattered lords, survivors who dug holes and prayed to forgotten gods. They stepped into the clearing cautiously, eyes wide, mouths agape. They saw the dead truly dead. They saw the cold lifting. They saw Eddard Stark, the man who had haunted them as a legend of terror lying in the snow. Peaceful, no crown, no blade, just a man, and that made it more powerful than any dragonfire. 2 days passed before they buried him, not in ice, not in a walker tomb, but in Winterfell, in the crypts, beside the ones he loved. Jon and Arya carried his body through the broken gates themselves, the remaining Northmen clearing a path, heads bowed. No one spoke. No one dared. It was Sam who met them there, his face gaunt, eyes red-rimmed. "You should have seen the citadel," he told Jon quietly. They were already writing the history. The Ice General, the White Wolf of the North. And now, Jon whispered, we tell them the real story. Arya placed a stone at the head of the crypt. On it, 3 words were carved in the language of the first men. Winter remembered him. The kingdoms changed quickly after that, as if the death of one man had broken the spell over the land. The lords of the south, who had long squabbled over titles and taxes, now wrote treaties by candlelight. The riverlands sent grain north, Dorne opened its gates to refugees. The Vale stopped pretending it could float above disaster. The seven kingdoms, once shattered, began to stitch, but power hates a vacuum. And Ned's death didn't just end winter. It created questions: who leads now? Who protects the peace he died to restore? Whispers rose like mist. Some wanted Jon Snow, others feared him, feared his blood, his Stark loyalty, his Targaryen name. Others whispered Arya's name, the girl who had walked into the frost and come out alive. The girl who'd survived the apocalypse and stood at the edge of death without flinching. But she wanted none of it. She had done her part. She had made peace with ghosts. Now she only wanted silence. In Dragonstone, Daenerys looked out across the sea, dragons coiled at the cliff edge, restless. She hadn't ridden north. She hadn't faced Ned, and that decision haunted her. She had prepared for fire against ice, but she hadn't prepared for the dead to weep. The realm no longer feared her dragons. They feared silence. They feared the next winter. They feared the cost of ignoring men like Ned Stark when they returned changed. She summoned Tyrion, asked him simply, "What now?" He answered, "You either become a queen they believe in or another myth they forget." In the north, Jon stayed. He didn't return to the wall. The wall was gone, and the Night's Watch no longer had a purpose. He walked the ruins of Winterfell day after day, speaking to no one, answering letters only when forced. He visited the crypts alone at night, sometimes staying for hours in silence, sometimes muttering to the stones. No one knew what he said, but the people began to come. First from the villages, then from the smaller castles, then lords, then children. They brought food, stories, songs. They didn't speak of thrones. They didn't care for politics. They came because they believed he had done what needed to be done. And more importantly, they believed he hadn't done it alone, that he had helped Ned Stark find himself again, that he had reminded winter of its warmth. He hated the attention, but he didn't turn them away. Arya left without a word. She boarded a ship from White Harbor at dawn, alone, no destination given. Just west, into the unknown, where no songs had been written and no gods ruled. She carried her father's dagger, not as a weapon but as a memory. She left no message. Only a single carved word scratched into the dock post where her ship had departed. Free. Bran in the far north dreamt of ravens, of frost and fire. He saw the last fragment of the walkers buried in the deep, whispering through roots and rocks. He warned no one, not yet. He knew better than most. Even peace is just a pause in the storm. Back in King's Landing, the Iron Throne sat empty for longer than ever before. Some wanted to melt it, others wanted to fill it, but more and more people said the same thing. We don't need a throne. We need someone who remembers the cold. That someone, they believed, was gone. But others whispered Jon Snow's name again. He refused to leave Winterfell until the day came when a raven arrived. Carrying a scroll sealed with black wax bearing no sigil, Jon opened it. Inside, only a line. A storm rises in the west. He looked to the horizon. He remembered Ned's last words, "I kept my vow." Jon stood. The north stirred. And winter, it seemed, was not finished yet. Was not finished yet. Years passed, but the cold never left completely. Though the long night had ended and the White Walkers shattered like brittle glass under the weight of Eddard Stark's final defiance, a chill remained in the corners of Westeros, like a ghost that refused to be forgotten. Crops grew again, though slower in the north. The wind still spoke in whispers during the darkest nights. Children were born who cried louder when it snowed, and the name Ned Stark had evolved from history into myth. In Winterfell, Jon Snow remained a reluctant symbol. He'd never taken a crown, never claimed a title. He ruled not by decree but by presence. He spoke little, worked often, and walked the grounds of his rebuilt home like a man waiting for the next wound. The people didn't demand speeches. They brought him food, repaired walls, sang songs in the yard, and in return they felt safe. The North healed, not through laws or taxes, but through silence, through remembering. Each year on the day of Ned's sacrifice, the townsfolk lit torches along the King's Road, one torch for every life saved, and every year more torches burned. They didn't celebrate him as a warrior or a king. They honored him as something more ancient, the last man who made winter feel like it had meaning. But peace, as always, was an illusion. Thou slow lie. In the far west, beyond the Iron Islands, beyond the stretch of sea that most believed led to nothing, Arya Stark disappeared from maps. But not from legend. Sailors returned with impossible stories. Of a ship painted black with no flag. Of a woman with cold eyes and a blade carved from bone. Of islands that vanished behind clouds the moment you left them. Some said she found another continent. Some said she found the origin of the White Walkers. Some said she found nothing at all, just peace. And silence, and the kind of death that didn't follow you home. None of the stories ever agreed, none of them needed to. In King's Landing, the Iron Throne remained empty by design. After Ned Stark's death, something in the realm had changed. Not just politically, but spiritually. The people no longer believed in kings chosen by war or lineage. They wanted leaders chosen by memory, chosen by consequence. The Great Council now ruled. Lords and ladies selected to guide the realm together. A dream Ned once mentioned to Maester Luwin, whispered long before any war began, now forged into reality. But unity did not equal safety. The raven that had arrived at Winterfell years ago, the one bearing only the words, "Their storm rises in the west," was not forgotten. Jon Snow kept it folded, in a leather pouch near his heart. He read it sometimes in the still hours before dawn, and he always asked the same question: had Ned sent it, or had something else survived? Bran had grown strange in his solitude beyond the wall. More tree than boy now, some whispered. He no longer blinked, no longer ate. Ravens perched on him for hours, as if he were just another branch. He spoke only through dreams now, to those who could understand, and even then only in warnings. He had seen cracks in the world. Not fire, not frost, but something older. Ice was not the first darkness, he once said in a dream Jon barely remembered. Before the cold came the silence, and across the sea silence had begun to stir. Ships vanished near the sunset sea. Meisters who studied old magic either went mad or fell mute. Children began to speak in strange tongues during sleep. And above all, the wind had changed direction. It no longer blew from the north, it blew from the west. Jon prepared quietly. He did not summon armies. He did not send ravens. He only packed his sword. He visited the crypts one last time, stood before his father's tomb. "I'm not ready," he admitted. "But I know what you'd say." He paused. "Duty is never about readiness. It's about remembrance." Outside Ghost waited, larger now, his fur streaked with grey. Still loyal, still silent. Jon mounted his horse, gaze turned toward the setting sun. Behind him, the north stood strong. Ahead of him, the unknown waited. And as he rode, the final snowflakes of the old winter drifted down, melting before they touched the ground. In the distance, the sea roared, not like water, but like something waking up. And in that roaring, Jon heard it, a whisper that belonged to no man, a voice older than fire, colder than ice, and it said, "Remember what was broken. Remember what was buried." For winter was never the end, only the beginning. The story of Ned Stark had ended in the snow, but the war he died to stop had only paused, and the world once again braced for darkness. Only this time, there would be no one to bring the cold, because the cold had already been conquered. Now it was silence's turn, and silence does not forgive, does not forgive.